conjure up certain images in your mind's eye, and then we're going to go through those after the story. So here's the story of the lost son. This is a true story from the Mamprusi people's tradition. Centuries ago, the Nairi, the overlord, the paramount chief, the king of Mamprugu, he was in his palace and he sent all his children out to the fields to work in the farm. And so they all went out to the fields, all the kids, and the younger ones, as younger ones do, they were playing and goofing around. And one of the young boys, he went and he laid down under a large tree and he fell asleep. Now the other kids kept playing and playing, and eventually the sun started to go down. So they all went back to the palace. And they got back to the palace, and their mothers had prepared food for them, and they ate their food, and they bathed them, and they sent them off to bed. And one of the queen mothers noticed that one of her boys was not in the room with her. So she went to the king and she said, "Where's our son, the prince? This prince is missing." And so they woke everyone up in the compound, in the palace. They looked around, they couldn't find him. So the king then raised the alarm and called the warriors. And the warriors came and he told the warriors, "My son is missing. We need to find my son. Wake up the whole village." So they fired their guns in the air. The drummers came. They told the drummers started beating their drums. They went around the village. They gathered everybody. Everyone came to the palace. And the king came out and he said, "My son is lost and we need to find him." Now this is in the days when there's no electricity, so he took some thatch, some straw, and he lit it on fire, and he held it out, and everyone lit some more thatch from that, and they fanned out in the village, and they looked all over for the son, but they couldn't find him. So then they went to the edge of the village, and they still didn't find him. And finally they went out into the fields, and lo and behold, there he was, still asleep under the tree. So they woke the prince up, and they picked him up, and they threw all their torches on the tree and set the tree on fire, and they carried the son back to the palace. And they got to the palace, and the king saw his son, and he rejoiced. His son was lost, and now he's found. And he said, "From this day forward, we're going to celebrate every year a festival to remember that my son was lost, and now he's found." And so from that day on, they have the fire festival, and that's the reason for the fire festival. And once a year, we gather at the king's palace in the village where we live, and the king comes out, and he throws a flaming torch on the ground, and everybody rushes up to light their own torches, and they parade around town celebrating late into the night. So, I told you that story, and there's certain things in that story that probably came up in your mind. One was king. Now, as Westerners, this is usually the type of king we think of. King Arthur, right? He's in our Western mythology. But our king is a very different looking person. This is the current king of Mamprugu. His name is Nairi Nabwahagu Abdulai Mahami Sherga, and he is the overlord of Mamprugu, and he's been ruling since 2003. His grandfather, the Sherga, at the end of his name is his grandfather's name. That was the king who gave all the land to the Baptist missionaries to build the hospital 60 years ago. So he's got a direct connection, and he's very kind and favorable to us at the hospital. Now the other thing I mentioned was a palace, and perhaps you came up with an image in your mind of a palace, right? We're all Florida folks down here, so this is a popular Florida palace. Some of you, anybody been to that palace? A few of you, maybe? Okay. Well, the palace in Dalergu, where we live, is a bit different. It's a little more low-key. This is an older photo. They've since painted it hot pink, so it's got a nice vibe going on now. I think this is when Ken and Joe were there. I believe that's them. There's Joe in the picture. Yeah. And I mentioned a prince and a tree. And here's another kind of Disney image that you might have conjured up in your mind. You've probably seen this movie many times. But it's a very different thing where we live. We live in the Sahel, between the rainforests and the Sahara Desert. So it's a vast plains expanse. We have not many trees. The one tree that we're known for in our area, probably the biggest tree, is the baobab tree. And you may have heard of the baobab tree, but that's more likely the type of tree that the boy fell asleep under. And I said the prince, well, the king has over 20 wives, and so you can imagine he has lots of princes and lots of grandchildren princes. And the princes are called the Wurumwachera, which means the horse grass cutters. And one of your jobs, if you're a grandchild or a son of the king, is you go and collect grass for the king's horses. And in the rainy season, they like to come to our house because I'm pretty lax about mowing my lawn, to say the least. And so there's nice grass at my house. And so these are the princes at my house collecting grass for the king's horses. And finally in the story, there was the tree. Now, I told you that the boy laid down and fell asleep. In your mind, you probably thought, well, they were playing Boys get tired, they lay down under trees, and he just fell asleep. It's hot in Africa, right? But in the story, do you remember what they did to the tree? They burned the tree. You see, in West Africa, people are very, very aware of spiritual things. In fact, they hyper-spiritualize everything. There are bad spirits. If you're walking down the aisle here and you trip and fall, someone might think it was a spirit that caused you to trip and fall, or a curse that someone put on you. And so the logic in that story is the tree was the reason the boy fell asleep and caused the distress. There must be some sort of evil spirit in the tree that was trying to harm the king and his family, and that's why they burned the tree. But as Americans, we would never think of that. You wouldn't think that, a tree falls on your house in a storm, and you say, well, there was a storm and there was wind and it fell and it was an old tree. But to a West African, the mind would go to spiritual things. So we have this challenge of learning the culture and learning what they're thinking when we say things. I have a teenager now, and a lot of times the words that I say and he hears are not the things that he understands, right? That happens. Happens in marriages too. I'm saying one thing, and they say they hear me, but then something else gets understood.